When I decided to move to the country, the idea was simple: to seek peace, tranquility, and a refuge from the hustle and bustle of the city. The farmhouse I found seemed perfect, an old but well-kept building surrounded by ancient trees and fields that looked like they had never been touched. The price? Incredibly low. But what I didn't know is that some bargains cost much more than the money. The first night at the farmhouse was peaceful, too peaceful. The silence was almost deafening, as if the surrounding nature were holding its breath. As I went to bed, I heard the distant sound of crying. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was clear, filled with deep sadness. It echoed through the hallways, as if coming from all directions at once. I got out of bed and followed the sound to the old back room, where the air was cooler and the musty smell was almost unbearable. When I opened the door, the crying stopped immediately. The room was empty except for a dusty old mirror that was tilted against the wall. When I touched it to move it, I felt a sting of ice pass through my fingers. The reflection revealed something that made me flinch, a dark, almost indistinct shadow that was moving behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. On the second night, the noises intensified. Now, footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, heavy and steady, as if someone were deliberately walking down the hallway. Each step made my heart race, and even though I knew I should check, my body simply refused to get out of bed. The most terrifying thing happened on the third night. I was trying to sleep, but the sound of a door slamming loudly echoed through the house. I ran into the hallway, only to see all the doors, including the ones I had locked before going to sleep, wide open, banging violently against the walls. Amidst the chaos, I caught a glimpse of a pale, sunken-eyed female figure standing frozen at the end of the hallway. She looked at me with a pain so intense that my knees nearly buckled. Before I could react, she disappeared, leaving only a whisper in the air. "Get out, while you can." That night, I finally understood. Something sinister was on that farm, something ancient and angry, and it was trapped there for a reason. I should have heeded the warnings, should have heeded the whispers from the neighborhood about the curse that haunted this place. Now, I was part of the dark history of the abandoned farm, and the true face of evil was only just beginning to reveal itself. As the night wore on, the dread became almost palpable. The air was thick with a cold dampness that made my bones tremble. I knew I had to leave the farm before it was too late, but an invisible force seemed to keep me tied to this cursed place. I decided to explore the attic, a place I had avoided until then. The stairs creaked under the weight of my footsteps, and each creak seemed like a warning cry. The attic was covered in cobwebs, dust, and old boxes that seemed to hold secrets from a dark past. As I explored the room, I found an old, dusty wooden box with a rusty lock. Curiosity overcame fear, and I managed to open the box with an agonizing snap. Inside it was a book bound in worn leather. I opened it, and as I turned the pages, the ink seemed to glow with a faint, almost supernatural light. The words were written in an ancient, incomprehensible language, but the illustrations were clear. Images of macabre rituals, sacrifices, and demonic figures. There was also a handwritten note in irregular handwriting that read, "Whoever invokes evil will find no rest. Those who dare disturb the sleep of the ancients will know their torment." My heart pounding, I began to feel a growing presence, an almost physical pressure that seemed to intensify the more I read. The air around me began to heat up, and a feeling of oppression enveloped my body. The shadows on the walls began to writhe and take shape as if they were alive. The cries I had heard earlier turned into desperate screams, filling the space with unbearable anguish. Suddenly, a shadow materialized before me, an ethereal, distorted figure with empty eyes and an expression of unspeakable pain. She approached slowly, and the feeling of fear I felt was so intense that it almost felt like physical pain. The screams grew louder, more piercing, and the feeling of being watched had never been so overwhelming. The figure reached out a spectral hand toward me, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed the book and, with the last bit of courage I had, ran out of the attic. The door seemed to slam shut against me, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to disintegrate. The sound of the screams was deafening, echoing through the hallways as I struggled to get out of the house. Finally, I made it to the exit. The front door opened with a final groan, and I threw myself out, falling onto the cold, damp grass. I looked back, and the farmhouse seemed to have transformed into a black mass of shadows and despair. The windows were lit with an eerie red light, and the house seemed to be breathing, pulsing with an evil energy. I escaped the farm, but the experience left an indelible mark on my mind. Sometimes I still hear the screams and see the distorted shadows, as if something dark and ancient was waiting to find me. The abandoned farm has never left my mind, and the knowledge that the evil there never truly rested remains with me. The curse of the farm is not just a story. It is a constant reminder that there are horrors that should never be awakened. As the night wore on, the dread became almost palpable. The air was thick with a cold dampness that made my bones tremble. I knew I had to leave the farm before it was too late, but an invisible force seemed to keep me tied to this cursed place. I decided to explore the attic, a place I had avoided until then. The stairs creaked under the weight of my footsteps, and each creak seemed like a warning cry. The attic was covered in cobwebs, dust, and old boxes that seemed to hold secrets from a dark past. As I explored the room, I found an old, dusty wooden box with a rusty lock. Curiosity overcame fear, and I managed to open the box with an agonizing snap. Inside it was a book bound in worn leather. I opened it, and as I turned the pages, the ink seemed to glow with a faint, almost supernatural light. The words were written in an ancient, incomprehensible language, but the illustrations were clear. Images of macabre rituals, sacrifices, and demonic figures. There was also a handwritten note in irregular handwriting that read, "Whoever invokes evil will find no rest. Those who dare disturb the sleep of the ancients will know their torment." My heart pounding, I began to feel a growing presence, an almost physical pressure that seemed to intensify the more I read. The air around me began to heat up, and a feeling of oppression enveloped my body. The shadows on the walls began to writhe and take shape, as if they were alive. The cries I had heard earlier turned into desperate screams, filling the space with unbearable anguish. Suddenly, a shadow materialized before me, an ethereal, distorted figure with empty eyes and an expression of unspeakable pain. She approached slowly, and the feeling of fear I felt was so intense that it almost felt like physical pain. The screams grew louder, more piercing, and the feeling of being watched had never been so overwhelming. The figure reached out a spectral hand toward me, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed the book and, with the last bit of courage I had, ran out of the attic. The door seemed to slam shut against me, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to disintegrate. The sound of the screams was deafening, echoing through the hallways as I struggled to get out of the house. Finally, I made it to the exit. The front door opened with a final groan, and I threw myself out, falling onto the cold, damp grass. I looked back, and the farmhouse seemed to have transformed into a black mass of shadows and despair. The windows were lit with an eerie red light, and the house seemed to be breathing, pulsing with an evil energy. I escaped the farm, but the experience left an indelible mark on my mind. Sometimes I still hear the scream. Autumn arrived, and with it, a deeper darkness seemed to cover the farm. With each passing day, the feeling of unease intensified. The harvest was in full swing, and the cornfields, now dry and withered, seemed to hide something evil beneath their surface. The wind carried an almost human moan that mixed with the night's whispers. Nightmares became a constant, with images of shadows chasing me through the house and sinister figures moving at the edges of my vision. One particularly cold night, the terror materialized. I was alone in the house, while my family tried unsuccessfully to ignore the paranormal events. I decided to check the barn again, hoping to find a logical explanation for the disturbing sounds that were giving us no peace. The lantern trembled in my hands, and the sound of the wind seemed to echo in my mind, mixed with a voice that begged for help. When I opened the barn doors, I was enveloped by a nauseating smell, as if something rotten was rotting inside. The shadows cast by the lanterns created grotesque shapes on the wooden walls. The silence was oppressive, and I could almost feel the presence of something lurking. My heart pounded as I moved forward, each step echoing with a sharp crack. The feeling that something was about to happen made me hesitate, but curiosity and fear drove me forward. At the back of the barn, among the sacks of grain and old tools, I discovered something I could never have imagined: an opening in the ground, nearly covered by debris and dust. My fingers trembled as I touched the edge, and a cold sensation ran through my body as I opened the hole. Below, the darkness seemed to swallow the light of the lantern, and a smell of wet earth and decay rose up to meet the cold air of the barn. As I stared at the opening, a low, sadistic laugh began to form deep in the darkness. The sound was grotesque and piercing, as if someone were mocking my fear. Panic seized me, and I jerked back, nearly falling. With a colossal effort, I slammed the lid shut and ran out of the barn. But when I got home, I realized that the atmosphere had changed. The house was cold and silent, and something was clearly wrong. The doors were open, and the room was in total disarray, as if it had been ransacked. The lights flickered erratically, and the floor was covered in bloody footprints that were not ours. The shadows seemed to move almost independently, and the terror intensified with each passing second. That was when I heard an agonized scream coming from the field. The sound seemed to be a collective scream of pain and fear, mixed with the whispers that were now clearly audible. I ran outside, my heart pounding so hard I could feel each beat in my ears. The field was empty, but the feeling that something was about to reveal itself was overwhelming. The shadows moved again, and an oppressive presence began to manifest itself. I could feel a biting cold enveloping me, and a shadowy figure appeared among the crops, its eyes glowing a spectral hue. The entity seemed to form from the shadows themselves, with an indistinct outline, but an aura of pure evil. The fear was so intense that I nearly fainted. Running back to the house, we locked all the doors and windows, and spent the night in a state of absolute panic. The following nights were filled with terrifying dreams and whispers that never ceased. Finally, after a week of incessant torment, we decided to abandon the farm. There was no rational explanation for what we had experienced, only the certainty that there was something deeply wrong with the farm, something beyond human comprehension. The Oliveira farm remained empty, a dark reminder that there are places where darkness nests, patiently waiting to manifest itself. To this day, the cornfield is a place we avoid, and the sound of the whispers continues to haunt our memories, an echo of the terror we will never forget. The night at the Screaming Farm seemed darker than any other. The moonlight, filtered through the heavy clouds, cast distorted shadows over the fields and the old house. The surrounding trees swayed in a whispering wind that seemed to whisper ancient, forgotten secrets. The feeling of being watched was constant, as if the very walls of the house were lying in wait. The old farmhouse, with its creaking boards and broken windows, had recently been purchased by a young family looking for a new beginning. What seemed like a chance for a fresh start quickly turned into an unspeakable nightmare. From the very first day, something was wrong. Strange sounds echoed through the house, a low, uninterrupted wail that seemed to originate from the walls and the dark basement, as if they were hiding something terrible. At night, the screams became more distinct and desperate. They were not ordinary screams from a nightmare. They were screams of pain and suffering, almost as if an echo of an ancient tragedy were trying to escape the prison that held it. These sounds permeated the house, reaching the bedrooms, making the floors shake and the doors creak. The young mother, Anna, tried to remain calm, believing that the sounds were just the typical noise of an old house. But when her son, Lucas, began to have nightmares and woke up crying, saying that they were calling, she could not ignore the growing sense of terror. His father, Marcos, tried to investigate, but with each attempt to discover the source of the screams, he was met with a deeper and more disturbing silence, as if something was waiting for the right moment to reveal its secret. It was then that, on a particularly cold and moonless night, Marcos decided to go down to the basement, where the sound seemed more intense. The stairs creaked under his feet, and the air was heavy with a musty smell and something indefinable, something that made his throat close up. The darkness in the basement was almost palpable, and he had to use a flashlight to illuminate his way. When he finally reached the bottom, the flashlight revealed walls covered in dark stains and a floor covered in layers of dirt. In the corner of the basement, Marcos found an old, rusty door that he had not noticed before. His heartbeat quickened as he turned the cold, heavy doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small room that looked as if it had been left behind for decades. In the center of the room was a table covered with old papers and objects, but what really caught his attention was the unbearable smell of decay emanating from a locked trunk hidden beneath the table. The feeling that something was about to happen was overwhelming. Marcos hesitated, but curiosity and fear drove him to open the trunk. Inside, he found a collection of old diaries, full of disturbing notes and macabre drawings, which spoke of rituals and practices of worshiping dark entities. There were also old photos of people, some with looks of terror on their faces. However, what really made Marcos' blood run cold were the accounts of a horrific event that had occurred on the farm. A cult that performed bloody rituals, and eventually, the revelation that those who failed to comply with the sacrifices were condemned to wander the farm, screaming for all eternity. With each page he turned, the reality became darker and more terrifying. Marcos began to understand that the farm was not just haunted. It was charged with the energy of a curse that should never have been revealed. And as he read on, the screams became louder, more desperate, as if they were trying to warn him, or perhaps begging for help. The feeling of being trapped in a sinister trap, and the palpable fear of something that could not be seen, but was definitely present, left Marcos paralyzed. Whatever was hidden in the screaming farm had an evil power that seemed to have been released with the opening of the chest. And so, as terror settled over the farm and screams became a constant part of the nights, Marcos and his family found themselves increasingly entangled in a secret that, from that moment on, would change their lives forever. The following weeks were a real torment for Marcos and his family. The farm seemed to have turned into a place of continuous nightmares. Each night, the screams intensified, becoming almost unbearable. The feeling of an evil presence was palpable, as if something was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The situation reached a critical point the night the house began to change shape. Marcos and Anna were in the living room, trying to maintain a semblance of normality for Lucas, when they began to hear a different sound. It was like the roar of an animal, followed by a deep, resounding rumble, as if something colossal was moving within the walls of the house. The floor shook beneath their feet, and the doors began to slam violently, as if an invisible force was trying to break through. The tension reached its peak when, during one of these hellish nights, the atmosphere in the house changed drastically. The temperature suddenly dropped, and a biting cold took over every room. Anna, her nerves on edge, decided to investigate the basement once more, hoping she could find some clue to understand what was happening. Going down to the basement now was an act of almost suicidal courage. The stairs creaked ominously, and the air seemed denser and more charged than ever. Each step she took seemed to echo throughout the space, increasing the feeling that something was following her. When she reached the small room where Marcos had found the trunk, she noticed that the atmosphere was different. The smell of decay was stronger, almost unbearable, and the papers and objects on the table were in disarray, as if someone had recently moved them. Anna found something new on the table, an old candle, burning with a pale and unstable flame. Around it were macabre drawings made with something that seemed to be dried blood. The smell of iron in the air was unmistakable. As she approached the candle, Anna noticed that the flame seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. The shadows cast by the dim light danced eerily, creating distorted figures that moved across the walls. The tension grew when suddenly a loud, piercing sound cut through the air, like the scream of a creature in agony. Anna ran for the exit, but the basement door was locked. She desperately tried to open the doorknob when she felt a cold, oppressive presence behind her. She turned slowly and saw an ethereal, almost translucent figure hovering in the air. The figure's face was contorted in an expression of pain and terror, and its eyes, although lifeless, seemed to be staring directly at Anna, begging for help or perhaps revenge. The figure began to approach, and Anna felt a fear so deep that her body began to tremble. Each step the entity took seemed to make the room shake, and the screams Anna had heard were now coming directly from the entity's mouth. The feeling was that the house itself was alive, and that all the tortured souls that had been sacrificed there were trying to free themselves. Anna, in a desperate impulse, picked up one of the diaries and began to read aloud. The words were an invocation to pacify the spirits, an attempt to calm the troubled souls. But the more she read, the more the screams intensified, as if reading was releasing an even more powerful and evil force. When she finally managed to open the door and run outside, the farm seemed to have gone mad. The windows were blown out, and the walls seemed to be bleeding a black, viscous substance. Marcos and Lucas were waiting at the entrance, their eyes wide and full of terror. They grabbed their things and fled the farm, without looking back. What they left behind was a place of eternal horror, a farm that now seemed to be permanently marked by suffering and chaos. The Scream Farm had revealed its secret, and it was now a place that carried an immortal curse. They were never found again, and the farm remains a grim reminder of what happens when sinister secrets are revealed. With each person who passed along the nearby road, a sense of oppression and dread enveloped them, as if the farm itself were trying to draw more souls into its eternal torment. And so, the Screaming Farm remains a place where the echoes of pain and despair never cease, a grim reminder that some doors should never have been opened.